The fog rolled in thick and unhurried over the quiet hills of Fermoy, County Cork, the morning air still heavy with the damp chill of April 1991. Chapel Hill was a street like any other in rural Ireland, a narrow road hemmed in by stone walls and small, neat houses whose chimneys puffed ghostly wisps into the pale light. Inside one of those houses, Conor and Sheila Dwyer lived a life that might have been called ordinary, if not for the mystery that would soon consume the town and outlast an entire generation. Conor, a cab driver and part-time mechanic known for his polished manners and crisp attire, and Sheila, graceful, reserved, deeply rooted in faith, had spent decades building a rhythm together. Mass on Sundays, phone calls to her sisters every Thursday, the clatter of dishes after dinner while the radio hummed low. There was nothing in their lives that suggested chaos, scandal, or an ending so abrupt it would feel supernatural. Yet on the last days of April, the Dwyers walked out of their small world and vanished as if Ireland itself had swallowed them whole. Their car, a white Toyota Cressida bearing the number 5797ZT, would never be found. Their voices never again heard. Their house remained still, blinds drawn, beds made, as though time had paused waiting for its owners to return. If stories like this fascinate you, make sure to like, follow, and comment what you think happened. Every theory helps us uncover a little more of the unknown. The disappearance of Conor and Sheila Dwyer began not with a scream or a clue, but with silence. On April 30th, they were seen attending evening mass, walking side by side through the cool twilight like they had done countless times before. The following day, Sheila made a brief phone call to one of her sisters. Calm, routine, nothing out of the ordinary. And then, nothing. No more calls. No more sightings. The quiet that followed stretched for 3 uneventful weeks until May 22nd, when concerned relatives alerted the Gardaí. Officers forced entry into the couple's home on Chapel Hill and found a scene that defied logic. The house was immaculate, no sign of struggle, no luggage missing, no passports taken, no bank withdrawals recorded. The bed was made with precision, dishes washed and stacked neatly, and Sheila's handbag, containing cash and personal documents, sat untouched on the dresser. It was as if the Dwyers had simply walked out the door for an errand and dissolved into the mist. Yet beneath that eerie calmness lingered a disquieting detail. Their car, their only vehicle, was gone. That absence, one white car, untraceable to this day, would become the axis on which one of Ireland's most haunting mysteries would forever turn. When Gardaí first combed through the Dwyers' home, they noted how untouched everything felt, almost too perfect, too staged, like a photograph of domestic life rather than a lived-in space. There were no broken locks, no overturned furniture, no trace of forced entry. Conor's shaving kit was still beside the sink, a faint scent of aftershave lingering in the air. Sheila's rosary beads hung neatly over the bedpost, and a half-finished crossword sat on the kitchen table, a pen resting mid-sentence. Even the curtains had been drawn evenly, as though whoever closed them planned to return by evening. But that evening never came. For the people of Fermoy, the realization was slow and unnerving. It wasn't just that the Dwyers were missing, it was that nothing about their disappearance made sense. Cars can be stolen, people can run away, but houses do not hold their breath like this unless something has gone deeply wrong. The Gardaí began their investigation with a strange mixture of urgency and disbelief, trying to reconstruct the last ordinary moments of 2 people who had vanished without leaving even a fingerprint of their departure. The search for the Dwyers began with simple questions that quickly spiraled into something far darker. Neighbors recalled seeing the white Toyota Cressida parked outside the house on April 30th, but by May 1st, it was gone. No one had seen it leave, no engine sounds in the night, no headlights cutting across the narrow road. A small town like Fermoy thrived on the details of its residents' lives. Everyone knew who drove where and when, and yet no one could account for the car's disappearance. Gardaí expanded the search outward, scouring local roads, nearby forests, and the river Blackwater that wound like a shadow through the countryside. Divers entered its cold, silted waters, their lamps flickering against the dark current, searching for the glint of metal, a license plate, anything. But the river gave up nothing. The land gave up nothing. Even air searches turned up empty. For the first time, investigators began to whisper the unthinkable, that Conor and Sheila might have left willingly, stepping beyond the boundaries of their life into some secret, unknown world. Yet anyone who knew them would tell you that idea was impossible. They had built their lives around order, not chaos, around faith, not secrecy, around presence, not absence. As the hours turned to days, Fermoy transformed from a tranquil Irish town into a place gripped by uneasy curiosity. The Gardaí conducted door-to-door interviews, retracing every step of the Dwyer's known movements. Sheila's sisters described her as gentle, methodical, and deeply attached to her home. She wouldn't have left without her prayer book or the family photographs that still sat neatly on the mantelpiece. Conor's acquaintances painted him as a quiet but proud man, devoted to his work as a cab driver and occasional handyman for a German businessman who lived nearby. A relationship that would later draw uncomfortable speculation. What struck investigators most was the absence of motive. No debts, no disputes, no visible cracks in their marriage. Even the neighbors, known for gossip as much as kindness, couldn't recall a single argument. It was as though the Dwyers had been erased, not merely vanished. Their car, that white Toyota Cressida, became a symbol of the case, both clue and curse. Every few months, new rumors surfaced, sightings of a similar car near the coast or on a ferry to France. But when checked, each one dissolved into thin air. For all the world's vastness, not one trace of that car or of the Dwyers would ever be confirmed. In the space they left behind, Fermoy's collective imagination began to twist and darken. People whispered of debts to unseen men, of secret trips abroad, of something buried beneath the calm surface of their marriage. But none of it fit the people Conor and Sheila truly were. The Gardaí investigation soon reached beyond County Cork, extending across Ireland and even into continental Europe. Detectives checked ferry records at Rosslare and Cork Harbour, searching for any trace of the Toyota's license plate among cars that had crossed to France or Spain in the days after April 30th. Interpol was notified. Posters with the Dwyers' faces, formal, polite, and hauntingly ordinary, were distributed at airports and train stations. Then came the first alleged sighting. A couple matching their description seen in Lourdes, France, quietly entering a church. Another report placed them in Munich, boarding a train to Austria. Each report reignited hope and then crushed it as investigators found no supporting evidence. It was as though the world itself conspired to keep them hidden. The Dwyer's sons, living abroad, returned to Ireland in anguish, searching through their parents' papers, re-examining every small habit and friendship for a clue. What they found instead was a haunting absence of conflict or warning. Conor's last recorded actions, filling his car with fuel, paying a small utility bill, were mundane to the point of absurdity. For Gardaí, it was a case that mocked logic. People could disappear, yes, but not like this. Not without trace, not together, and not in a world already wired with witnesses and roads. As weeks passed, silence hardened into something heavier, a collective grief that no one could name, a weight pressing down on the heart of Fermoy. By midsummer of 1991, Fermoy had become a place of murmured theories and drawn curtains. Locals gathered in the small cafe near the bridge, speculating in low voices while pretending to sip their tea. Every so often, a stranger would drive through town and heads would turn. Was it the car? Had the Dwyers returned? But the car never appeared, and the house on Chapel Hill remained empty, its windows reflecting the grey Irish sky like blind eyes. Garda kept returning to the same haunting question. If the Dwyers hadn't left voluntarily, then someone must have helped them disappear, or made them vanish by force. Yet there was not a single shred of physical evidence to suggest abduction or violence. Even the family dog, a gentle terrier named Finn, had been left behind, fed and watered for at least a day after the couple's disappearance, suggesting a deliberate pause before everything ceased. Investigators replayed every possible sequence of events: the drive to Mass, the phone call to Sheila's sister, the missing car. And still nothing added up. One senior officer later remarked, "It was like chasing shadows through fog. Every lead turned into mist." Fermoy's unease became folklore. Parents whispered warnings to their children about never going off alone, as if the Dwyers' disappearance were some ancient curse come to life. As media coverage intensified, the Dwyer case took on a life of its own. National newspapers called it Ireland's most polite mystery, because there was no crime scene, no scandal, no visible trace of sin, only order, interrupted. Reporters arrived from Dublin, parking vans outside Chapel Hill, filming the house's facade as though it might blink or breathe. Some locals cooperated, others resented the intrusion. "They're gone," one elderly neighbor told RTA. "But it's the not knowing that's killing us." Garda organized a renewed dive of the River Blackwater, this time with sonar equipment borrowed from naval authorities. They searched every bend, every eddy, dragging nets through black water thick with silt and old secrets. They found rusted bikes, car parts, even a long-lost safe, but not the Cressida. Some investigators began to believe the car might be buried somewhere on land, hidden in an abandoned shed, or covered in earth deep within a farm field. Yet again, searches came up empty. The Dwyer's absence began to mutate into something mythic. Locals swore that on foggy mornings, you could still see two silhouettes walking near the old chapel, hand in hand, silent, forever heading somewhere they would never arrive. Years passed, and the Dwyer's home slowly decayed into a relic, a place both frozen and fading. Grass grew thick in the driveway where the Toyota had once rested, ivy climbing up the stone walls like fingers reclaiming what was theirs. Children dared each other to look through the windows at night, whispering that the house was cursed, that you could still smell Conor's aftershave in the hallway or hear Sheila's footsteps pacing upstairs. Inside, the furniture remained as it had been, preserved by the Dwyer's sons who could never bring themselves to sell it. Each object felt sacred, like evidence in a case that time refused to close. Garda still visited once a year, mostly to check if anything had been disturbed, though no one believed the mystery would ever unravel. It had become part of Fermoy's identity, not just a tragedy but a question embedded in the soil. Local priests mentioned the couple during sermons about faith and uncertainty, reminding their congregations that not all disappearances mean death. Some believed the Dwyers had chosen exile, perhaps fleeing something no one knew about. Others, that they had fallen victim to something sinister, buried deep beneath Ireland's quiet landscape. Theories multiplied like ghosts. One rumor spoke of Conor's connection to the German businessman he occasionally worked for, a man described as secretive, dealing in luxury cars and cross-border transactions. Could Conor have been drawn into something dangerous, unknowingly? Some investigators speculated that the Dwyers had witnessed or been involved in something that made them targets, their disappearance orchestrated to keep them silent. Others clung to the more tragic idea that an accident had occurred. Perhaps the car had plunged into an unsearched section of the Blackwater, swallowed whole by mud and current. Divers disagreed. They had mapped every known stretch of the river, but rivers, especially Irish ones, are older and deeper than anyone believes. A third theory, softer, almost romantic, imagined that Conor and Sheila had simply chosen to vanish. That, weary of routine, They had driven into the mist and started anew somewhere else, perhaps under new names. But the evidence, the untouched money, the abandoned home, the waiting rosary beads, made that story fragile. The more people tried to explain their disappearance, the more the truth seemed to recede, like the tide pulling everything that mattered out to sea. By the late 1990s, the Dwyer's case had entered that strange territory reserved for the unsolved. Half memory, half myth. Television programs revisited it every few years, flashing their photographs on screen, while somber narrators recited the same limited facts. Each retelling added a subtle distortion, like ripples spreading across dark water. A retired Garda detective, interviewed for one of these programs, confessed that the case still haunted him. "They didn't just disappear," he said quietly. "They were removed." The phrase lingered, chilling in its precision. Removed from what? From life? From records? From Ireland itself? The investigator spoke of his conviction that the key lay with the car. That white Toyota Cressida, which had become both a phantom and an obsession. A handful of psychics even offered assistance, claiming to see the vehicle submerged in murky water, doors open, lights flickering beneath the surface, like eyes refusing to close. None of their locations matched, and searches came up empty once more. Yet the image persisted. A car trapped between worlds, holding the answers no one could reach. As years stretched into decades, technology advanced, but the mystery stood immovable. New forensic tools, satellite mapping, and sonar imaging were applied to old cases, including the Dwyers. Hope flickered again when in 2019 investigators announced plans to re-examine the riverbeds with updated scanning systems. The Gardaí, careful not to reignite false expectations, stated only that new avenues of search are being explored. For locals, it was enough to reopen old wounds. Reporters returned to Fermoy, now a quieter, older town, and found people still hesitant to speak. "It never left us," said one cafe owner, staring into her cup. "You can't live near that house and not feel it." She pointed toward Chapel Hill, where the Dwyer's home stood unchanged, its curtains permanently drawn. For a moment, it felt like time hadn't moved at all, as though the Dwyers might still walk through the door at any moment, bewildered by all the attention. But time had moved, mercilessly. The case had become more than an investigation. It was a meditation on absence, a story that refused to end because it had never truly begun. When RTA's Crime Call revisited the disappearance in 2024, the Dwyer story returned to the public eye with a new wave of collective fascination and sorrow. The segment featured old family photographs, Conor smiling stiffly beside his car, Sheila holding a teacup in the garden, images so ordinary they felt almost cruel, reminders of how small and fragile life can appear when frozen before disaster. The Gardaí once again appealed for information, releasing computer-generated projections of what the couple might look like in their 80s. Viewers across Ireland called in with memories, speculations, and alleged sightings. None verifiable, yet each one offered in good faith, as if the entire nation felt responsible for their return. "Someone knows something," said the program's host, his voice low, solemn. But what if the truth was simpler, or more terrible, than anyone dared imagine? The broadcast reignited public debate. How can two people vanish in a country as mapped and watched as Ireland? It was a question that echoed across living rooms and social media alike, and beneath it lingered the same chill that had haunted Fermoy for 33 years. Perhaps the Dwyers had never truly left at all. That night after the broadcast, Chapel Hill grew restless again. Locals reported seeing flashes of light near the old Dwyer house, reflections perhaps, or something else. An elderly neighbor swore she saw movement behind the lace curtains, though no one lived there anymore. Another claimed to hear faint music, like a radio playing an old waltz. Gardaí investigated, of course, finding nothing. But something about that night seemed to unsettle even the most rational residents. Stories spread quickly, the kind that start as whispers and end as folklore. Some said the Dwyers were still there, trapped between the world they knew and whatever lies beyond the veil of disappearance. Others claimed the land itself had claimed them, as if Fermoy's soil demanded offerings every few decades. Of course, no one could prove any of it. Yet when the fog settled over the town again the following morning, thick and luminous, it was easy to believe that maybe, just maybe, two lost souls were still walking those narrow roads, unseen but never truly gone, forever retracing the steps that led them away from everything they once called home. The deeper one dives into the Dwyer's story, the more it begins to resemble a mirror, reflecting the fears, superstitions, and secrets of those who study it. Some investigators who revisited the files in the early 2000s admitted that the lack of evidence created a kind of psychological gravity, pulling them into endless theories. The documents contained nothing extraordinary: receipts, phone records, a few witness statements. Yet between those ordinary lines lay the contours of something uncanny, an absence with structure. The Gardaí's final report from that decade concluded with a single ambiguous line: no criminal act can be ruled in or out. It was both a bureaucratic formality and a haunting confession of impotence. One detective, interviewed anonymously, suggested that there might have been an unspoken agreement among some officials to let the case rest, not from neglect, but from fatigue. "It's hard to fight a ghost," he said. The Dwyer's sons, still living abroad, stopped granting interviews, unwilling to reopen a wound that never healed. "We've made peace with not knowing," one reportedly told a journalist. But peace is a word that rarely applies to stories like this. Among amateur sleuths, however, peace was never an option. Online forums dedicated to Ireland's cold cases kept the Dwyers' names alive, dissecting every rumour, every anomaly. One thread focused entirely on Conor's mysterious employer, the German businessman, noting that he abruptly left Ireland a few months after the disappearance. Another debated the possibility of forged documents or false identities, pointing to inconsistencies in banking records. Some went further, proposing that the Dwyers had been involved in covert work, smuggling, or even intelligence. The theories became increasingly elaborate, each bending facts to fit imagination. Yet beneath the digital noise lay a genuine longing, not for scandal, but for closure. Every new theory carried the same plea: someone must know. The case became a canvas for collective obsession, proof that mystery feeds something primal in us, the need to confront the void and name it. Even those who mocked the supernatural whispers admitted there was something inexplicably off about the whole affair. Not a single solid lead, no physical evidence, no confirmed sighting in over 3 decades. It wasn't just a disappearance anymore. It was a hole in reality, perfectly shaped to fit 2 human lives. In the winter of 2025, a small private search team, volunteers using advanced sonar and drone technology, quietly revisited the River Blackwater once more. They weren't affiliated with Gardaí, but motivated by obsession and compassion alike. Local fishermen watched as their sleek equipment hummed over the cold, ink-dark surface, scanning the unseen world below. The team leader, a retired naval diver named Patrick Keane, had followed the Dwyer case since his youth. "There's something down there," he said in an interview, "something the river won't give back." For 3 days they searched, marking anomalies on their sonar maps, metallic echoes, vague shapes half buried in sediment. Each time they lowered cameras into the water, hope rose and fell in equal measure. On the final day, they recovered nothing but a rusted bicycle frame and an old iron stove. Yet when they packed their gear, one of the divers swore he saw a glimmer beneath the surface. 2 faint points of light, spaced like headlights, flickering once before vanishing into darkness. Whether it was an illusion or something real, no one could say. But that night, Fermoy's fog seemed thicker than usual and whispers spread again. The river remembers. If the Dwyer's disappearance began as a tragedy, it had by now evolved into something else, a meditation on loss and the limits of human certainty. Psychologists who studied long-term missing person cases often described the phenomenon as ambiguous loss, a grief without closure that corrodes families and communities alike. Fermoy had become a living example. The Dwyer's story still surfaced in conversation, at wakes, in pubs, on winter nights when the fire crackled low. It wasn't gossip anymore, but ritual. The townspeople spoke of them the way others might speak of saints or ghosts, invoking their names softly, as if afraid of disturbing the balance between memory and forgetting. Some said the couple's house radiated a coldness even under sunlight. Others claimed the air around it grew still whenever you passed by. Whether these sensations were born of fear, faith, or imagination hardly mattered. What endured was the sense that something unseen had brushed against the town and left a permanent mark. And though the Gardaí officially still list the Dwyers as missing, everyone in Fermoy knows the truth carries a deeper weight, one that neither evidence nor time can erase. By now, the Dwyers had become Ireland's quietest legend, two names uttered in the same tone reserved for sacred mysteries or unsolved prayers. Writers, podcasters, and documentary filmmakers all took turns trying to resurrect them through story. Some painted the couple as victims of a well-hidden crime. Others imagined them as wanderers who stepped out of their lives like actors leaving a stage. Yet every retelling seemed to circle back to the same haunting stillness. The untouched house, the missing car, the unanswered phone. Even historians began referencing the case as a symbol of Ireland's hidden histories, of what remains unspoken beneath a culture of politeness and restraint. The Dwyers remind us, one essayist wrote, that disappearance is the final rebellion, the refusal to explain. It was a poetic thought, but for those who had known the couple, it felt cruelly romanticized. Conor and Sheila weren't trying to prove a point. They had been kind, rooted, ordinary. Their lives deserved reason, not myth, and yet myth was all that time allowed. In the end, that was the paradox of the Dwyer's story. The more people searched for truth, the more it transformed into legend, until fact and folklore became indistinguishable shadows walking hand in hand. In the archives of the Gardaí headquarters in Dublin, the Dwyer file still rests in a pale blue binder labelled Active Missing Persons. Inside are faded photographs, witness reports typed on yellowing paper, and notes scribbled in pencil by investigators long retired. One margin bears a faint coffee ring, the mark of someone who had once stayed up too late, staring at the impossible. A digital copy exists, but the original file is treated with a kind of reverence, as though touching it might disturb the fragile line between the living and the lost. Every few years, a new detective reviews it, perhaps hoping to be the one who finally cracks the silence. They all leave the same way, puzzled, humbled, and quietly changed. "It's not the kind of mystery you solve," said one officer in a 2023 interview. "It's the kind that changes you for having looked." The Dwyer case had become less a question of what happened and more an echo of how disappearance itself can exist. And in that echo, the faintest trace of Conor and Sheila still lingers, not as evidence, but as presence. As the decades slipped by, even the physical traces of the Dwyers began to vanish. Their sons, now elderly themselves, rarely returned to Fermoy. The house was eventually boarded up for safety, the walls flaking, the garden overtaken by nettles. Yet locals still left flowers on the doorstep each May, a quiet ritual marking the month they disappeared. Sometimes a candle, sometimes a folded note, always anonymous. Visitors described an almost sacred silence around the house, broken only by the rustle of wind through the ivy. At night, when the moon cast its pale glow across Chapel Hill, the property looked like a photograph from another century, a fragment caught between light and memory. Few dared to linger long. There was a sense that the air itself carried a question that no one wanted answered. Over the years, even skeptics admitted to strange sensations. The faint sound of footsteps on gravel, the brief scent of flowers that weren't there, a feeling of being observed. Nothing dramatic, just the subtle, unnerving awareness that something unseen still lingered. Fermoy had long stopped trying to explain it. It was enough to remember. In 2025, a small production team arrived in town to film a new documentary about Ireland's unsolved disappearances. Their focus inevitably turned to the Dwyers. The filmmakers were respectful, yet the townspeople treated them with a cautious distance, as if afraid that dredging up the story might disturb the delicate peace that had settled over the years. One evening, while filming exterior shots of the old Dwyer home, a cameraman noticed something strange through the lens, a flicker of movement behind an upstairs curtain. He froze, called to the director, but when they reviewed the footage seconds later, there was nothing. Just the lace curtain swaying slightly, though the windows were sealed tight. The team dismissed it as wind or reflection, but the local guide accompanying them turned pale. "That window," he whispered, "hasn't opened in 30 years. They packed up early that night, avoiding the subject altogether. But when the documentary aired months later, viewers flooded the comment section, time-stamping the same frame. A faint outline near the window, indistinct but unmistakably human. The footage went viral, reigniting the Dwyer mystery for a new generation. Online forums buzzed with analysis, users enhancing the image, debating whether the shadow in the window was a trick of light or something far more disturbing. Paranormal investigators flocked to Fermoy, setting up cameras and sensors around the property at night. The Gardaí quickly intervened, cordoning off the area to prevent trespassing, but the fascination only deepened. Among the footage recorded by one amateur team was an audio clip, faint, nearly drowned by static, that some claimed contained whispered words. When filtered and slowed down, it sounded like a woman's voice saying, "We didn't mean to leave." Experts dismissed it as pareidolia, the human mind creating meaning from noise, yet even skeptics admitted that the timing was unnerving. The Dwyer house, once a symbol of grief and unanswered questions, had become a magnet for the supernatural. Still, for every ghost hunter drawn by curiosity, there were locals who resented the intrusion. To them, the Dwyers weren't legends or phantoms. They were people, stolen from their lives. Whatever the truth, it deserved reverence, not spectacle. They were real, one elderly neighbor told a reporter. They loved, they prayed, they lived here. Don't turn them into a story. But that plea came too late. The Dwyers had already crossed the line from tragedy to myth, carried there by decades of silence. In Dublin, archivists reviewing old case materials stumbled upon a curious detail that reignited investigative interest. A 1991 report mentioning tire tracks found on a rural road near the river, dismissed at the time as unrelated. The record described a vehicle of similar size and make to the Dwyers' Toyota Cressida. Modern analysts, using digital enhancement on the scanned photographs, suggested the tracks led toward an area of the river that had never been fully dredged due to unstable ground. It was a small lead, almost forgotten, but in a case defined by absence, even whispers mattered. Within months, a fresh search was authorized, employing underwater drones and ground-penetrating radar. Locals gathered quietly at the banks as the machines whirred to life, their red lights flickering in the mist. Hope and dread coiled together in the air. But after 2 weeks, the effort was called off. Nothing. No car, no wreckage, no trace of the Dwyers. "It's like the earth swallowed them," a young investigator murmured. And once again, Fermoy exhaled its long, mournful silence, as though the town itself had learned to keep its secrets well. By this point, the Dwyer's disappearance was more than a police file. It had become an emotional inheritance passed down through generations. Grandparents told the story to their grandchildren not as warning, but as mystery, a reminder of how thin the line is between presence and absence. Tourists occasionally wandered to Chapel Hill, drawn not by curiosity alone, but by something quieter, more reverent. They would stand before the boarded windows, often in silence, leaving behind rosaries, coins, or pressed flowers. Some swore the air felt different there, denser, charged with memory. Others felt nothing at all, yet left uneasy nonetheless. Fermoy, once defined by routine and familiarity, had become a place known for its haunting, not of ghosts, but of questions. Each year, as May approached, local papers republished the same headline: "Still missing, Conor and Sheila Dwyer." Each year, fewer people remembered the faces behind the names, yet the mystery endured. It had transcended memory, belonging now to the land itself. Perhaps that was the cruelest truth, that after so long, even remembrance becomes a kind of forgetting, the story outliving the people, the silence louder than the search ever was. Standing at the banks of the Blackwater today, one can almost hear it, the quiet hum of time-swallowing sound. The river moves with slow, deliberate rhythm, its surface calm enough to reflect the pale sky, concealing whatever secrets lie beneath. Somewhere below, silt drifts like falling ash, settling on things long lost. Or perhaps there's nothing down there at all, only water and unanswered questions. The Dwyer's fate remains unwritten, their absence a thread woven through Ireland's darker folklore. Were they victims, fugitives, or wanderers into another kind of realm? The answer feels perpetually out of reach, suspended just beyond understanding. What remains are fragments, the scent of Conor's aftershave, the imprint of Sheila's rosary beads, the whisper of a car that might still be driving through the fog, searching for home. And maybe that's where the story truly lives, not in the solving, but in the haunting. Because some mysteries once born refuse to die. They simply change form, echoing through generations like a prayer without an amen. If you stand on Chapel Hill at dawn, when the fog drifts low and the air tastes faintly of river water, it's easy to imagine the second before everything changed, the Dwyers stepping out their front door, locking it behind them with the small domestic certainty of people who expect to return. The street remains nearly the same. Uneven stones, hedges trimmed by habit, the soft murmur of morning radios behind lace curtains. Yet something in its silence feels curated, as though the town has unconsciously staged a set to preserve a vanished moment. Local law says their last walk to Mass still replays itself in the blue hour before sunrise. Two patient silhouettes at the crest, arm in arm, heads slightly bowed as if listening for a bell that never rings. Rational minds dismiss it as superstition, an afterimage produced by memory's overexposure. But the heart of Fermoy has learned that not everything can be dismissed by daylight. The Dwyers were never entirely gone. They slipped beyond the perimeter of comprehension, leaving a pressure in the air, a pause in ordinary sentences, a window that seems to watch you as you pass. What lingers is not terror anymore, but a kind of reverence, the hush one uses in a sanctuary. Their names are spoken softly in kitchens and at bus stops, like a prayer that is also a question. If absence can have texture, theirs is woven into the town's weather, a breath on the back of your neck, a hush over the river, the sense that if you turned at precisely the right moment you might glimpse them, not as ghosts, but as neighbors running slightly late, keys in hand, the day still young enough to be ordinary. For investigators and storytellers, the Dwyers embody the futility of certainty. Every document, every sworn recollection, every sonar sweep collapses against the same unyielding surface. the unknowable. And in that resistance, something unexpected blooms: empathy, imagination, humility. To vanish so completely, to elude the adhesive of records and rumor across decades, is almost metaphysical in an age that catalogues the trivial. The file offers possibilities, and none of them convince. A river that keeps its secrets, a planned departure that left behind the very tools of reinvention, a redaction by human hands so precise that even the motive was erased. In that vacuum, belief becomes a working instrument. Did they fall into darkness by accident or malice? Did they step gently and together into a different story with a new name and a quieter sky? No affidavit can resolve those questions, but the imagination insists on seating them somewhere safe. I picture the Cressida cresting an unfamiliar hill at dawn, headlights dimming against a foreign coast, salt on the air, a map folded to a clean page. I picture two people who had grown expert at kindness, granting themselves an impossible permission to be unfindable. It's a dangerous kindness to offer because it asks us to forgive absence. Yet perhaps that is why their story endures, not because evidence promises a conclusion, but because their vanishing invites a gentler art, the willingness to hold a question without bruising it into an answer. And if that is a kind of faith, then Fermoy practices it daily, lighting its small candles of speculation, letting the flame flicker without insisting it become a torch. What keeps the Dwyers alive is not horror, but silence. A silence shaped like two ordinary lives, continually replayed by those left behind. Every town knows this ritual. The window watched past midnight, the cup left on the table just in case, the way the phone's dial tone becomes a liturgy. Their mystery teaches a cruel arithmetic. There is no villain to defeat, no confession to extract, no march of forensics to parade toward a chorus of resolution. Instead, there is the slow work of remembrance, which is also the slow work of surrender. Their names are stitched into speeches about public safety, memorialized in lists read each year, and carried in the pockets of people who never met them but feel responsible somehow for finishing a sentence that refuses its period. That is why the story persists through news cycles and fashions, past anniversaries and algorithmic attention spans. It has learned to live on less than answers. It walks the river path in a gray coat and returns home with empty hands, and still the walk matters. When the mist thickens and the town grows quiet, the Blackwater whispers the same syllables it has whispered for more than 3 decades, not words, but the cadence of a question. Sometimes it feels as if an answer draws near, a pressure change, a hush that tightens behind the ribs. Then the breeze shifts, and the moment loosens its knot, and the town goes on with its ordinary mercies. Bread delivered, curtains straightened, flowers left at a door that will not open. The absence remains, tender and exact, like a place set at a table no one dares clear away. So we end where they began. 2 people, an uncomplicated morning, a car easing into the pale Irish mist. The engine note softens, the road bends, the town forgets to notice because ordinariness is always the best disguise. Somewhere, in memory, in myth, or in a stubbornly literal corner of the world, the journey continues. Perhaps there is a ferry announced by a gull's cry and the slap of tide against pilings, a deckhand waving them on as if they were any couple with a bag and a plan. Perhaps there is only the river and a silence we are still learning to read. Either way, the story refuses extinction. It has become part of the weather, part of the hedgerows, part of the interior climate of anyone who has loved and lost without the ceremony of goodbye. If disappearance is a language, the Dwyers taught Fermoy how to speak it softly, without exploitation, without the counterfeit comfort of certainty. We do not solve them, we accompany them, to the chapel gate in the half-light, to the quay at first bell, to the curve in the lane where the hedges briefly hide the world beyond. There is grace in that accompaniment, and also a permission, to leave some mysteries intact, not as escapes from truth, but as reminders that truth is larger than our nets. Conor and Sheila did not vanish into nothing. They diffused into the fog and the habit of remembering, into the mouths of river stones, into the undramatic holiness of a question that still stands. If this story haunts you, let it. Let it do its quiet work. And when you breathe out, breathe their names, lightly, the way the river says them, not an ending, but a tide that keeps returning.